But as far as this repairing DNA damage is concerned, the more time it has before the cell divides, the better chance that there is it'll be repaired, the damage will be repaired. And it turns out that low-level radiation increases the time before the cell divides. So it gives more time for repair. So there are all these different ways in which low-level radiation is expected to be protective against cancer. And so those are important auxiliary reasons for not accepting this idea that the risk is just proportional to dose down to the lowest levels. And it's been a big fight. I mean, there are a lot of scientists. I'm convinced that it's a goodly majority of involved scientists believe that it's not true, that this extrapolating down to very low doses, assuming that the risk stays proportional to the dose down to the lowest doses. I'm convinced that a goodly majority of involved scientists believe that's not true for the reasons I've been stating here. There are societies of scientists who promulgate this position. They publish journals, they have meetings. There's an annual meeting of people on this discussion. There are a couple of journals published on the effects of low-level radiation with the idea, and if you look at those journals, you'd be convinced that low-level radiation is not dangerous and may well be protective.
So there is a large community out there that think that low-level radiation is a good thing. And
right.
What astounds me is why isn't this more in the mainstream?
Well, I don't know what you call the mainstream. Now, what EPA considers to be the mainstream is they get a committee that it's actually, they have the National Academy of Sciences appoints this committee to study the effects. They're called BEIR, B-E-I-R, Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation. And there have been 7 of these committees now down through the years. And these committees have reported that they've supported this linear theory. They put out reports, and people write criticisms of these reports. Now the question is how these committees are constituted. You know, if I could appoint a committee that would give any result I want.
Sure.
And nobody seems to know how these committees get put together.
I mean, my father used to work for DuPont, and he had investigated irradiated food, right? Because
right.
it lasts longer, basically.
Oh, I can give you a lecture about that.
Anyway, but he was saying that he didn't think, this was at the time back in the 60s, that he would be able, DuPont didn't seem to think that you could get the public on board with this because of this fear of radiation, because of Hiroshima and nuclear, the bomb threat sort of in the 60s.
The radiation seems to strike fear into people, and way beyond rationality. And they aren't afraid of getting food poisoning, but they're afraid of irradiated food, even though the irradiated food doesn't have any radiation. But just the fact that it's been exposed to radiation, they don't understand the difference.
Well, I think that they don't understand it, and I think that there's been a lot of play maybe in the science fiction world too of, mutations because of radiation and
yeah, well, that is true. I mean, certainly high levels of radiation can be dangerous and can cause all sorts of bad things. Not all sorts. The main
right.
thing it does is cause cancer.
Right, but let's say, someone was saying sort of that it's all about the dosage, but certain things, like, if you were to drink mercury, for example, You know, I mean, how low of a dosage, you know, and everybody's worried about PCBs in the fish and the mercury in the fish, and, you know, we seem to eat it tuna regardless of the mercury, but...
Well, the dose is certainly important. You know, very low doses are not necessarily damaging. In fact, there are many things where a low dose is vital to live, and a high dose kills you.
I mean, that's where I think that your comment about potassium is so amazing, is that if you told people as they were going into the health food store that potassium was radiated, they would have a heart attack.
It's not radiated, it emits radiation.
Oh, it emits radiation. You're right.
Natural. But it wouldn't do any good about going into the grocery store because your body needs the potassium.
Well, exactly.
In fact, and it regulates it. If you eat more potassium, it just sloughs it off. And if you don't eat enough, it makes you, you know, it gives you a tremendous desire to eat more.
Bananas.
Yeah, but you hit it. My house had high radon. In fact, it was really a nice advantage. I had a big radon research project, and my house was one of my main laboratories. And but anyhow, my wife didn't like the idea, so she put in a system for reducing the radon. It was like $1,000 or so. Yeah, that's what people do. When people have high radon in their houses, ordinarily they try to reduce it, and it costs $1,000, $1,500
I
to
was
do it.
looking at a system myself until I started working on this documentary, and then thought, well, I can save myself $1,000 and open a health spa in my basement. So
Well,
anyway, so your wife bought into the system.
and we had it done, and reduced the radon level way down. In order to make the system work, you have to run an electric fan all the time. Well, then when I got all my data in, I turned off the fan. Decided it wasn't worth the electricity.
How did she feel about that?
Well, she never told me.
But did she accept your findings?
Yeah.
Because, you know, I think it's one thing.
Well, I mean, she accepts what I say about things like that. Yeah. Well, I mean, at the time when we put the system in, I still believed that radon was a dangerous thing.
I see. So it's not like you were telling her, look, you know, my findings, the science tells me that this might not be true. You were still of a mind that maybe radon was an issue.
Yeah, that's why I kept measuring radon levels in homes, was that I thought it was a problem, and so, well, anyhow.
So that's funny. So
That's the way that happened. So I turned it off.
What made you get interested in the study of radon? I mean, was it because somebody came to you and said, we need this problem dealt with, or just like you said, you were worried about it because you had high radon?
Oh, no, I didn't know I had high radon. Nobody knew anything. When I got into this, nobody knew anything about radon.
What year did you get into it?
Well, in the 1970s. I was involved with nuclear power, and that's still one of my major interests. I've written a few books about it. Suddenly, it was right in the late 1970s, it was discovered that the mill tailings, where they, you know, when uranium is mined, they have to put it through chemical processes to purify the uranium, and all the waste material is left at that site in what's called mill tailings. And these mill tailings are full of radon, because radon comes in directly from uranium. But when you purify the uranium, you take the uranium out, but the radon sources stay there. So
I see.
So they had this, and people start worrying that the radon coming from these mill tailings was causing a health problem. So that's how I got into it in the first place. And I started working on
nuclear waste, sort of.
Well,
Aspects of
waste from
cleaning
mining uranium.
Yeah.
It hadn't been through any nuclear
Right,
processes.
but it's just safety issues dealing with
nuclear power, yeah.
cleanup and
In fact, if you look at it, if you believe in the theory, that radon from these mill tailings is by far the most important cancer risk from nuclear power. I mean, all the people that worry about from radiation from nuclear reactors and from reactor accidents and from radioactive waste are all small compared with the effects of radon from these mill tailings. So, I mean, if you believe this linear theory, then there were TV documentaries. There were children would play on this tailings pile. The tailings pile was a nice sand, like a beach sand, and the kids would play on it, and then they used this sand to make in construction of houses. So these houses then had high radon levels and so forth. When all these things were being discovered, anyhow, so it became an interesting thing to measure radon levels in homes. Well, then I developed a process for easily measuring radon levels in homes, easily and cheaply, and then, but nobody, the public, wasn't aware of it and didn't care about it and so forth. And then there was an interesting situation developed in there was a nuclear power plant in eastern Pennsylvania, near Allentown, I guess it was, where they were building this nuclear power plant. And in a nuclear power plant, they have radiation monitors, so that when people leave the plant, if they picked up any radiation, they're told to go back and clean up before they go take it out of the plant. Well, but the plant hadn't started up yet, so there wasn't any radiation, but they had turned on the radiation detectors. And then they found this one worker there, set off these radiation detectors like mad, not when he came out of the plant, but when he was going into the plant. So they couldn't figure out what was going on. And finally they went back they found out that he had very high radon in his home. It's still it's called the Index House, has one of the highest radon houses that have been found. But anyhow.
And what was his health like?
Oh, no health problems. I mean, but everybody that's exposed to high radon doesn't drop dead.
I'm just fascinated. So anyway, so.
Well, anyhow, so then it dawned on people, why would his house have high radon? And it turns out there's a geologic area called the Redding Prong, which goes from Allentown to Bethlehem to Easton into New Jersey, and it's called the Redding. I guess it must go to Redding too, because it's called the Redding Prong. And all of these, along this Redding Prong, there were a lot of houses which had high radon, and this got some publicity, and people in that region start worrying about radon in their homes. Well, there was a commercial measurement of radon in homes available, which they were charging $50 for a measurement. But anyhow, the congressman from that area, which I happen to know him a little bit, asked me to come out and talk to his constituents about radon, just as I don't know, congressmen like to inform their constituents. And I went out and gave a talk, and got a big audience, and people seemed real interested, but they didn't want to know about all this technical stuff. All they wanted to know is how can they get a measurement of radon in their homes and see if their home has high radon. So I just felt the pressure, and I said, I'll tell you what, if you send a $10 contribution to my research program, I'll make a measurement for you. And this was just before Christmas, and the university mail system shuts down over Christmas vacation. We came back after Christmas vacation, and they brought my mail in sacks. And these were all people with $10 checks asking for a radon measurement. Apparently, the congressman had sort of publicized this. Well, anyhow, so I geared up and got into the radon measuring business. And well, anyhow, and then it wasn't long after that when Actually, in doing this, I found some other high radon homes. There was a home in Easton, Pennsylvania that had, I think, about as high as this index house had. And there are about a lot of high radon houses, many dozens of high radon houses. And of course, a lot of houses had appreciable radon compared to what people thought might be dangerous.
But it's the association with nuclear power that really got everybody all upset.
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't say so. I mean, that's what got me into it.
Well, I know, but it seems like all the constituents, they wouldn't have sent you $10 if they didn't think that there was some kind of hazard involved.
Yeah, but it had nothing to do with nuclear power.
Well, but because this guy who went into the nuclear power plant with high radon.
Well, that's how it was discovered.
Right.
But it had nothing to do with the nuclear power
No, of
plant.
course not.
So it just came out of the ground. In fact, it turned out that the house next door had very low radon. I mean, it's a very touchy thing. In fact, my house had high radon. My next door neighbor had low radon. It just happens to be what's under your house. It's in the construction of the house. If you have a lot of cracks in your basement floor, or some houses don't have a basement floor, they just have dirt, and then you would probably have high radon.
Yeah, I have a dirt basement, and so I had it tested, and it didn't seem to be that high.
Well, I mean, it could be more or less, but if you had a lot of radon in the ground under you, and you don't have a basement floor, most houses have a basement floor which keeps the radon out, except for cracks in the floor. And the way you prevent it is you pump the air out from underneath the floor, and that you're pumping the radon out from underneath the floor and sending it out into the air.
Right, but it sounds to me like it's a completely unnecessary endeavor.
Well, I turned my system off, so it shows my opinion. But on the other hand, I'm sure there's hundreds of thousands of people who are getting radon measurements and spending money to reduce it.
But I think that comes from fear and lack of good information.
Well, it's hard to know what to, the EPA recommends it. I mean, they're pushing this. They say that if you have more than a certain amount of radon in your house, you should do something about it. Now, as I say, the EPA has based their support on this National Academy of Sciences committee, which recommends this linear theory. Now, the French Academy of Sciences is the other way. I mean, they do studies, and their conclusion is that it's not true, that low-level radiation is not harmful. And they cite the same, they all know about the same science, but it's how you appoint a committee. It makes a big difference. I mean, different scientists have different opinions. They put different weights on different experiments and on different studies. And I always plead with people, tell me what you think is wrong with my study, and nobody ever tells me what they think. Well, several people have. They've suggested things, and then I've investigated, and I think I've convinced them that what they thought was wrong wasn't wrong. But
well, I agree. I mean, I'm always looking for the truth, and the scientific method seems to me the most rational way of going about finding the truth. But it seems to me a lot of scientists don't use the scientific method. They use it to manipulate it to fit some kind of hypothesis that they have that they're emotionally attached to.
Well, I mean, human nature is always involved in anything.
Right.
I mean, I don't think these people are being dishonest, especially. I mean, they just, that's the way people are.
Well, they have an opinion.
Yeah.
And so then they look at the evidence to support that opinion instead of looking at the evidence and then forming an opinion.
Well, I don't know, they claim to look at all the evidence and then form their opinion, but I don't think they do. I think that when you appoint a committee, people get emotionally attached to certain ideas, and they build maybe their experiments convince them that the other way. I don't like to look at people's motives. I assume
No.
people have good motives and honest motives.
Well, but what's interesting to me is to see how paradigm shifts happen and how people get attached to certain paradigms. I mean, like, for example, people are attached to Einstein physics, and they're sort of locked into that whole area. And, he didn't even agree with quantum physics at the time. And now everybody quantum physics seems to be sort of
Well, you look at
pedestrian.
at the experimental evidence, at the scientific evidence. The scientific evidence is fantastically overwhelming for quantum physics.
Right. But I always wonder, what is the tipping point that tips people in one direction or the other, and then later on it seems so idiotic that they went roaring off in that direction?
In physics, that doesn't happen that often. In physics, things clarify fairly fast. I mean, you get a consensus developing fairly fast. And
But it took quite a long time for quantum physics.
no, well, I wouldn't say that.
Well, I'm just saying that Einstein was anti-quantum physics,
well,
from what I understand.
some aspect of quantum physics.
Right. It didn't fit into his model.
Well, there are things in quantum physics that are pretty hard to accept, especially at that time. Well, it's hard for anybody to accept some of these things. The only thing that makes you accept it is you just look at all the evidence. I mean, there's a fantastic body of evidence supporting it. In physics, that's not a problem ordinarily. I mean, there might be an exception. Einstein at one point didn't like one aspect of quantum physics, that sort of thing. But when you get into biological things, there's a lot more room for disagreement and for different interpretations.
Basically, because we don't really understand biology as well.
Oh, nowhere near as well as we understand physics, of course. We don't know how to make a single. Nobody's ever created anything living out of nothing. Out of
Right.
things that aren't living, and we don't understand how how life really works. We understand a hell of a lot about it, but not
Right.
like cancer is. It's not understood, from beginning to end how cancer works. I mean, people are convinced that it starts with damage to a DNA molecule, which doesn't get repaired, and then when it multiplies, and then there are processes which cause it to not commit suicide, and then the immune system comes into play, and there general ideas are floating around, but nobody knows in any detail how it works or understands in any detail how it works. If you did, you'd be able to cure it. I mean, if you really understood how everything, anytime you really understand something, you can figure out a way to stop it.
Well, as they say, doctors are just practicing.
Well,
I'm just using it as a metaphor,
Yeah.
because they're
Yeah.
dealing with something that's so difficult to truly, like, for example, they used to use leeches. They thought that leeches were a bad thing. We sort of laugh at that, but then they figured out that maybe there was something to it.
yeah,
So, it's fascinating that have things flip-flop back and
did
forth.
bleeding. George Washington died that way from bleeding. and
Well, I
stuff.
mean, once again, it's the dosage. Maybe but they do say that there's a certain beneficial aspect to it.
Well, except, medical science was slow in developing, and wasn't until the 20th century that medical science became very effective. I mean, well, there was medical science and 3,000 years ago.
Egyptian time.
Yeah.
But we don't understand it because we can read the hieroglyphics, but we can't really understand
Well,
it.
but I mean, all ancients. I mean, look at the Indians had medicine men.
Sure.
I mean, when you have a problem, you do what you can. So,
Right.
if people had diseases, they try to do what they could to cure them, and maybe they found some successes. But in physics, you understand things pretty much all the way down to nothing. I mean,
Well, okay, here, let me just go off topic here for a second, because my
Well-
father's working in something called mass-free energy. Do you know anything about this? It was I can understand it when he tells me, but it's a Tesla technology that there are patents for machines that more energy comes out of the machine than goes into it. And it taps into a place that's, I think, subquantum. So that all this stuff sits sort of on top of this other world and it directly accesses energy. And there's a couple in Canada called the Correises. And they've got all these patents. And a lot of the hardcore physicists won't even look at the data.
well, if you tell somebody that you get more energy out than you put in, most physicists won't look at it. I'll put it that way.
But that's what I'm saying, is that because it doesn't seem to be possible,
Well,
people aren't even willing to look at the data.
Well, let them make it. You can make them look at the data. I mean, you build a machine which actually does it, and people will look.
That's what Dad says. So he's involved with various people that, say they've built the machine. So once you
Well,
build,
where is it? Let me see it.
well, a lot of them are so squirrely because they're worried about you stealing the stuff from them, and anyway.
Well, so patent it then.
Well, the Correises supposedly have the patents.
Well, then why? What are they worried about?
It's fascinating to me that he is frustrated by the fact that he knows a few, physicists that won't even look at the data because the result is something that's so fantastic that it couldn't be possible.
I'm surprised the patent office looked at it. I would think that the patent office wouldn't look at anything that violates conservation of energy.
Right, but I mean, like for example,
But if he says there is some energy somewhere that it derives, then it becomes possible.
all right, Wright brothers, it took them 2 years to get anybody in the government to even look at what they were doing.
Well, that's what the government is another matter.
Well,
altogether.
but scientists of the day thought that how could two bicycle mechanics do something that Langley and all these other famous scientists.
Well, they were all working on it. And,
Well, I know, but it's like it didn't seem possible. These two guys.
well, that's another level of what's possible.
But all of a sudden it becomes.
Well, when you demonstrate it, when you see it with your own eyes, you can't deny it. When they see that airplane flying, they
Right, but it took them. They had to go to the French, get the French interested before the Americans realized that, if we let the French.
Oh, you mean the army?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's another matter.
But I'm just saying that.
There you're in politics and stuff like that.
Well, anyway, thank you so much for talking to me, and
Well, it's a real pleasure.
I really appreciate.
Hope I've done what you wanted.
Oh yeah,